to our next Pause for Thought. And we have Joel Denno with us, speaking and sharing about Jonah, the big fish, race relations and comedy. So we'll be following the usual format as we have done so far, where Joel will come up and speak for 30, 35, 40 minutes. And then we'll have some time for question and answers and reflections and thoughts. And then there's refreshments afterwards, so do stay for that. So over to you, Joel. Welcome.
Thank you. You'll notice on the screen that it says Jonah and the big fish, which is a little bit of a red herring, because I'm not going to talk about the fish very much at all, but I am going to talk about comedy and race in the book of Jonah. And I'm going to start by looking at something which may seem really obvious, but which is quite significant to the opening of the book. And I'm going to take a little bit of time unpacking the first 3 verses of the book of Jonah. So the thing that might seem quite obvious is that the direction of travel in the book of Jonah is of symbolic importance to the comedy and to the plot of the book and to the meaning of the book. And this is evident right from the start, when in the first 3 sentences, which we'll look at in a minute, we've got a beautifully set up joke built on a repeated upward motion, and also on the reader's understanding of what it means to be a prophet of the Lord. So first of all, I'm going to establish a couple of things for the joke to work. So the first thing that we're going to look at is directions in the Hebrew Bible. So this is fairly obvious, but in the Hebrew Bible, when the direction is up, then that's good. We're going towards God. When we're heading downwards, then that's bad, and we're going away from God. So we find this all the time in the Hebrew Bible. God's located in the heavens, which are up. Human beings are located below on the earth. And the pit, or Sheol, is where one goes when one is suffering or dead. So upward motion is symbolic of things that tend towards God, and downward motion is symbolic of things that tend away from God. It may also be useful to know that east and west have some symbolic significance as well. So this helps the second half of the joke in these first 3 verses to pay off. But I'll explain it now so that when we get to the joke, we already know what we're looking for. So east in Hebrew is kedem, which is forwards or in front of. And the reason for that is because the sun rises in the east, and so if you're facing the rising sun, then you're facing forwards. The word for west, therefore, also means backwards. So again, if you get the directions east and west in the Bible, you could translate them. It's slightly more complicated than this because there are at least 3 words for east and west in the Bible. But the words that I've put on the screen there, if they're in the Bible meaning east and west, you could also translate them as forwards and backwards. So direction is important in Jonah, and we'll get to that. So too, though, is a recognition of the name of the central character. Now Jonah, if you go through the whole of the book of Jonah, it never says that he's a prophet. But it's assumed that the reader will recognise him, because he also appears in the book of 2 Kings. And can we read this? So in the book of 2 Kings, Jonah is introduced as a prophet. He's described as a prophet from Gath-hepher, who served during the reign of King Jeroboam. And we know that he's the same Jonah who appears in the book of Jonah because of the reference to his father, Amittai. So we've got 2 Jonahs, both the son of Amittai, and because the Jonah in 2 Kings is described as a prophet, we know that he's a prophet in the book of Jonah as well. So he's a prophet of the Lord who gave oracles to King Jeroboam. And that asks the question, what is the expectation of a prophet? So the prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures basically serves as a mouthpiece for God. God reveals the divine will to the prophet, and then the prophet relays that message to whomsoever it's appropriate to inform. And usually those messages are messages that are to be passed on to a person in power. Usually, in the case of the early prophets, whose stories are told in the books of Samuel and Kings, that message will be given to the ruler of Israel or Judah, because for the early prophets, Israel or Judah tended to be what they understood as the range of God's rule and influence. So, the designation prophet is also a designation as messenger. The title prophet depends on receiving messages from God and then delivering them. So, we'll go to the first 3 verses of the book of Jonah, bearing in mind the direction of the travel and the understanding of the role of a prophet. So here are the first 2 verses. So, and the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, Rise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to her that her evil rises before my face. I've provided my own translation of this in order to show you the construction of the joke, which doesn't appear in the NRSV quite so obviously. So the first word that God speaks to Jonah in the Hebrew is the word kom, which is spoken in the imperative, and it means rise up. Where it's translated into English as go, you lose that rising element. We then have a second instance of rising when God describes the evil of the city of Nineveh rising before his face. So there's an upward momentum in the first 2 verses. We expect, as readers who've identified Jonah as the prophet from 2 Kings, for this upward momentum to be continued. After all, what is the job of a prophet if it's not to follow the instructions given by God? So we expect Jonah to rise up. And verse 3 starts as we expect. And Jonah rose. The word vayakam is the future participle of the same verb that we saw in verse 2. So the kom is the imperative participle, and vayakam is the future participle of the same verb. Although it's also using a special Hebrew tense that occurs in narrative passages, which reverses the future and makes it a past tense verb. So that's called the vav consecutive tense, which is sort of unique to Hebrew and unique to Hebrew narrative passages. But that's just to explain why it's not a future and Jonah rose. It's talking about a past tense thing. But the vav, which appears, so Hebrew reads from right to left. So the first word in verse 3 is the one that begins with the sort of the stick-shaped letter. That stick-shaped letter is called the vav, and that's the bit that's added to the verb to turn it into the past tense. It also means and it can also be translated as but, which is what I think the NRSV does with it. So it turns it into but. But I think it's better as and Jonah rose. Partly because that puts us in the past tense and sort of fits with the whole of the rest of the thing. So and Jonah rose continues that upward momentum that we've seen in the first 2 verses. And it fits as well with our understanding of what a prophet is. Somebody who obeys God's command. God says, rise, Jonah rose. And it anticipates the rest of the verse. And so what we think is coming is something like, and went to Nineveh, where he proclaimed the word of the Lord to the people of that great city. But no. To run away from the presence of the Lord to Tarshish. So this is the punchline. Jonah rose and he ran away from the presence of the Lord to Tarshish. And so in this single clause, our expectations of the prophet are punctured The character of our protagonist is revealed. This is not going to be a po-faced story about the man of God responding as we expect him to respond. This is a comedy about a prophet who from the opening 3 verses doesn't live up to the title that he's been given in the book of 2 Kings. But there's more. Jonah doesn't rise to go up, as one might imagine. He rises, paradoxically, to descend. And first he descends to Japho, or Joppa, and then with the same verb, vayered, being used twice in the verse, he descends to the ship bound for Tarshish. So he descends twice. Having had the 2 rises, we then descend twice. And we lose some of this in the NRSV when it translates the second descent as simply, he went on board the ship. But he descended into the ship. I'm going to spoil the story here, but I'm assuming that most of you know where it's headed anyway. The descent that begins here in verse 3 carries on until Jonah has descended into the depths of the sea, into the belly of the big fish, or the great fish. The writer of Jonah appears to have struggled with adjectives. He only really knows one adjective, which is great. So it's a great fish. The only ascent between this point, where Jonah begins his descent, and Jonah's final destination comes when the sailors lift him up to throw him into the sea. So the joke is that Jonah is behaving completely contrary to the expectations of a prophet. The language which is used lulls us into a false sense of expectation, setting up the joke, and then reveals Jonah's rapid fall. But remember, I also said that east and west were important. So here is a map of where Jonah should have gone, and where the ship he boarded was headed. So instead of going forward to the east, so I don't know if you can see it on there, but he starts at point A in Israel and facing east to head towards Nineveh. So instead of going forwards in the direction of Nineveh, Jonah goes backwards, west, just about as far as he can manage. If you're interested, the distances are around 550 miles to Nineveh, so 550 miles forward, but instead he gets on a boat which is going 2,500 miles backwards to Tarshish. This is sort of approximate because we're not exactly sure where Tarshish was, but this is where people think it is, somewhere in Spain or Portugal. So I've spent quite a lot of time on those first 3 verses of the book, and I will go through the rest a lot more quickly. But what I hope that establishes is the genre of this book. This is comedy. And when we read through the rest of it, then we take that understanding that we're reading comedy into what we're reading. This is meant to be funny, so we're allowed to laugh. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who we decided that we would quite like to make a podcast. And so he's not a Christian, and I said to him, I'd like to do a podcast where we talk about books of the Bible. And he was up for that. And Jonah was the first book that I gave him to read, and we had a chat about it. And he said that what had first struck him was that he thought it was funny, but he didn't know whether he was allowed to laugh at it because it was the Bible. But you're allowed to laugh at this book. So the next question is, why is a comic book like this included in the Hebrew canon alongside the other prophetic books that we find there, which aren't comic really? So what I'm going to suggest is that Jonah is in fact a political satire. And in order to do that, I'll have to discuss when it was written and who it might be satirising. So first of all, though, here's the Collins Dictionary definition of satire. So a satire, a novel, play, entertainment, etc., in which topical issues, folly or evil, are held up to scorn by means of ridicule and irony. On top of that dictionary definition, I want to add that satire is frequently employed by minority groups to undercut the opinions and views of majority groups. And I think that this is what the book of Jonah is doing. And in particular, I think it's doing this regarding attitudes to race. So I need a little bit of context to explain this. So, as I mentioned earlier, Jonah makes an appearance in the book of 2 Kings during the reign of King Jeroboam II. So that's the second date that you can see on my list of dates. King Jeroboam. These dates are all approximate because we don't. The measurement of dates in the Old Testament period is really difficult, so they're all approximate dates. But Jeroboam was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel during the 8th century BC, and I've included the division of the land into 2 kingdoms in 930 BC as sort of a bit of context for that. So there was a united kingdom described in the Bible as being, it was united under the reign of King David and King Solomon, and then the kingdom divided in around 930 BC, and we have 2 kingdoms. Jeroboam ruled over Israel, which was the northern kingdom. Interestingly, most of the writings that make up the Hebrew Scriptures were written from the point of view of Judah, the southern kingdom. The people from Judah were the ones who were taken into exile in Babylon, whereas the northern kingdom had already been defeated and people had been carried off to various different places from the northern kingdom already. So the southern kingdom is where most of the literature comes from, because the putting together of the Hebrew Scriptures took place during and after the exile in Babylon. So that's where all the texts come from. So it's interesting that Jonah was a prophet from the northern kingdom. Although this, from the point of view of the reader, you might think that Jonah's slightly suspect already because he comes from the wrong kingdom. He's only just in the wrong kingdom, though. Gath Hepher is just on the sort of just north of the border between Israel and Judah. So I wonder whether we could then, rather than describe him as sort of a negative figure from the wrong kingdom, he's sort of a borderline character who doesn't quite fit in either world, in the world of the northern or the southern kingdom. Maybe he's neutral, or maybe he's sort of a cipher figure. So the dates of Jeroboam give us a rough setting for the story which is told in the book of Jonah. So that's the date at which the big fish happens, somewhere between 782 and 753 BC. What they don't tell us is when it was written or by whom. Apart from chapter 2, which is Jonah's prayer from inside the big fish, the story is related to us by a narrator who stands outside the text. They don't give us their name or any autobiographical information. At the time of the setting of the story, Assyria was an emergent power in the ancient Near East. It had already gone through a big period of expansion. It sort of reached a height, but at the time of King Jeroboam, it was experiencing a bit of a lull. It wasn't expanding anymore. In fact, the power in Assyria had been decentralised, and local kings ruled over city-states like Nineveh, rather than having one central king of Assyria. It wasn't as powerful as it had been. And this remained the case until 745 BC, so just beyond the reign of King Jeroboam II, when King Tiglath-Pileser III took over in Assyria, and Assyria began to grow again. And eventually that growth led to the conquest of Israel and the termination of the line of Israelite kings. So after Assyria conquered Israel, which was in 722, roughly, there were no more Israelite kings. That was the end of it. And then later again, under the rule of Sennacherib, Nineveh was made the capital city of all of Assyria. So the Assyrian Empire, during Jonah's time, is experiencing a lull. Then it got bigger again, and then after it had got bigger again and sort of centralised power for the second time, then Nineveh was made the capital. Up until this point, 705, it hadn't been a big city. So when Jonah, the author of Jonah, refers to it as that great city, Nineveh, it wasn't during the time of Jonah. It probably was about a mile from one side to the other in Jonah's time. But Sennacherib expanded it and made it the seat of his empire. So there are reasons for thinking that the author of Jonah, or at least the editor who included it in the Hebrew scriptures, might have had Sennacherib's Nineveh in mind when he was describing it as the great city, rather than the Nineveh that existed in the time of Jonah. It's described as a great city several times, and we're also told that it took Jonah 3 days to cross it. So unless you're walking very, very slowly, it doesn't take 3 days to cover a mile. So these descriptions, although you have to bear in mind that he was also delivering his message, so he would have been stopping and talking, but it's still 3 days is a long time to travel a mile. These descriptions make much more sense if they refer to a city that was an imperial capital rather than a regional capital. Now, Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, and after that, the southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile in Babylon. So these dates are significant because most of the writing, as I said before, took place during the period of exile. Or, if not the writing, because some of these texts may have predated the exile, but then have been edited and put together during the exile. It's really difficult to sort of piece together the construction of the Bible. So, as we've said, the identification of Jonah as a prophet relies on a knowledge of the book of 2 Kings. Now, the book of 2 Kings ends at the beginning of the exile into Babylon. So it seems unlikely that the writing of Jonah would predate the writing of 2 Kings. It seems as though Jonah is referring back to 2 Kings so that we know who the character is, and so it's likely that 2 Kings was written first and then Jonah was written after it. When I talk about the sort of the historicity and the dates of the composition of the various books of the Bible, I don't want that to be a major issue for concern, because these writings are really difficult to pin down. And the stories contained within them almost certainly predate the writing down of them. And on top of that, there's also the issue of canon and the organisation of the biblical books into a format in which we read them today. So it's possible that the story of Jonah is an 8th century BC story that was passed down to the exiles in Babylon, either by word of mouth or in a written form that's slightly different to the one that we have now. But there's also reason to believe that it's been adapted generically to fit the needs of a different time. And that different time, I want to suggest, is the time immediately after the return of the exiles from Babylon. So, the reason I think that Jonah reached its current state in the post-exilic period, so this is sort of 6th century BC after 539 BC, is the way that the satire that we've identified within it, or the comedy identified within it, addresses the majority views about race which are expressed in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So when the Israelites returned to the land following the exile in Babylon, they found that those people who'd been left behind, who were mostly uneducated workers of the land, had married into the families of foreigners and had adopted some of their religious practices. And Ezra and Nehemiah were furious about this, and their attitudes are reflected in their books. So this is a piece from Ezra. After these things had been done, the leaders came to me and said, "The people of Israel have not kept themselves separate from the neighbouring peoples with their detestable practices. And then it lists the neighbouring peoples. They've taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and have mingled the holy race with the peoples around them. When I heard this, I tore my tunic and cloak, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat down appalled. Then everyone who trembled at the words of God of Israel gathered around me, because of this unfaithfulness of the exiles. So that's in Ezra, and you get similar in Nehemiah. So moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called down curses on them. And then there's you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. Jonah, however, using a comedic prophet, an in-between borderline figure who's both insider and outsider at the same time, challenges these views and asks, does God really value people less dependent on their race? Jonah's comedy works because it says, here's a character that you expect to behave in a certain way, and then it shows that character behaving completely contrary to those expectations. We've seen that already with the figure of the prophet, but there are other characters in the book of Jonah, all of whom, incidentally, are foreigners. So, there are sailors in the book of Jonah. Look at the response of the sailors to God and compare it to the response of Jonah, who's allegedly a prophet and a messenger of the Lord. Initially, these foreign men pray to their own gods, which is understandable in their ignorance of the Hebrew God. But what it does show is that they turn, as soon as the storm rises up, they start praying. And then they wake Jonah, who's descended into the bowels of the ship. They wake him up and they get him to tell them his story. And when he does, they immediately believe him. And their fear grows. So how different is their response to God to Jonah's response? The fear of God is the beginning of a right relationship with God. After Jonah's been thrown into the sea and the storm ceases, then they respond exactly in the correct way again by offering sacrifices to the Hebrew God. So much then for the fears of Ezra and Nehemiah. Here, the foreigners do not contaminate the Hebrew religion, but they convert to it straight away. On top of that, the sailors are also heroic figures. Jonah tells them that they must throw him overboard, but they don't want his blood on their hands. And so before they do that, they attempt to row to shore in order to save his life. And it's only when this attempt fails that they throw him into the sea. So, what of the people of Nineveh? They're the other characters who appear in this book, also foreigners. How do they fare in Jonah? Immediately on hearing what Jonah says, we're told that they believe. So Jonah went out and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. He cried out, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. Not only that, but in response to their belief, they announce a fast and declare their intention to put on sackcloth, which demonstrates their penitence. And the king of Nineveh does exactly as the people do, responding straight away and covering himself with sackcloth. And the comedic details haven't dried up yet either, as we also get this image of all the livestock dressed in sackcloth. It's an exaggerated detail and it's funny, but it gets right to the point. The way the foreigners in this story respond to God is so much better than the way that the prophet responds. The reason that the people of Nineveh react in the way they do is because they trust in God's mercy. And note this, Jonah hasn't even told them that mercy is a possibility. He just goes and says, you're going to be destroyed. And they're the ones who see that God might be merciful and relent from punishing them. So then, to drive home the message, the book of Jonah ends with one more comedic episode. God withholds punishment from the Ninevites, and Jonah isn't happy. He's angry and he sulks. So God teaches him a lesson by providing him with the shade of a bush and then removing it via a worm. Again, another comedic detail, I think. Jonah becomes so angry that he could die, which I think is my favourite line in the whole book, where God says to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about the bush? And he says, yes, angry enough to die. And God asks, why do you care about the death of a bush? You didn't grow it. You didn't care for it. And the point is that, contrary to popular opinion, God does care about the fate of foreign peoples like those who live in the city of Nineveh. Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people, God asks. The foreigners, then, in this satire, are much more deserving of God's care than the messenger who refused to deliver a message and the prophet without mercy. So, that's pretty much the whole book, apart from the fish, which I'm not really going to get onto. So, to recap, Jonah is a book which opens with a joke that sets up the type of literature it is that we're reading. It confronts the expectations that its readers may have had about different types of people, first through the caricature of the prophet protagonist, and then through the actions of the secondary characters, the sailors and the people of Nineveh. Doing this addresses the concerns of the Israelites regarding foreigners, and especially in the light of the writings of Ezra and Nehemiah, the ways in which marrying outside of their own people group may influence their faith. Finally, Jonah asserts that God is concerned for all people, because God's influence stretches beyond the borders of the land, and even the people of Nineveh are in some way God's people. And this is one of the messages that begins to come through in the later prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's quite a big message, I think, of Jonah.
Huge thank you, Joel, for just opening up that book for us, and thank you so much to those who came, and I know that others will be with us online as well, or watching this later on YouTube. Thank you so much, and I don't know why I hadn't noticed before that bit about sackcloth and animals. It just really made me laugh and giggle. Our next pause for thought is, it's a bit of a break now, but it's November, Thursday the 24th, and it's a 7:30 p.m. one. And Nicholas will be talking about Old Marston during the English Civil War. So do share that with others that you think might be interested in Old Marston and its history. We've also got another pause for prayer coming up. I think that one is at the vicarage. It's the 30th of July. It's a picnic at 12:30. There's a sign-up sheet at the back in church. If you live further away and want to come to that, you're very welcome to. It's outside. And just send me an email and we'll love to see you there. So a huge thank you. Do have coffee and cake, and if you're with us, sit now with a coffee and just reflect over the wonderful presentation from Joel. So thanks again, Joel.